Welcome to Newegg Monster Build. I'm Frank from Eniac PC Builder, and today we're going to build one of the most monstrous computers you can conceive. So we're going to be using the Asus ROG Zenith Extreme Alpha 2 motherboard. Installed, we have the Threadripper 3990X 64-core 128 thread processor. So we have 128 gigs of 4000 megahertz Corsair Vengeance DDR4 memory. In total, it has 5 NVMe slots, and because we're going to be using water-blocked cards, you're going to have almost no access to your memory once those are installed. So they give you a very convenient little riser. So in this little riser, we have two 1TB 980 Pros. So this is the Optimus, I believe it's the Absolute Threadripper water block. So we're going to go ahead and pop this on. Let's make sure it's nice and clean of fingerprints and finger oil. It's never good for your cooling performance. Let's give it a quick little wipe. Let's grab some thermal paste. A lot of thermal paste for these. Make sure it looks good. So that should be the motherboard prepared. We have our memory, our CPU, of course, our storage. So we're going to be using the Phanteks. I believe it is the Enthoo Involve Pro 2 case. It is a massive tower case. It's actually designed for dual system use. So this case can actually have two systems. You have your main system up at the top. You can actually have an ITX board down there where the power supply normally would be on a regular case. So let's get these panels off. So now we have our bare case. First, we want to check all our standoffs are in place. This case comes with your standard ATX layout. We're just going to carefully drop our motherboard in. This motherboard is extremely heavy because it does have an all-metal backplate covering the entirety of the back. So it's just a simple magnet for these. They attach down at the bottom. So balance that out. Let's go ahead and get the power supply installed so we give it a little weight on the bottom here. Remove this little cover here. Hinge down. This build's going to be using our EVGA 1200 watt, sorry, not 12,000 watt. Graphics card's only pulling that much power yet. We're going to screw in the power supply with your standard 4 power supply screws. And we do have the rest of our cables here that we will plug in later. Let's start with our USB 3.0. Let's get the biggest cables out of the way first. So we have one 3.0 down here at the bottom of the motherboard. And we have a second up here towards the center, just above the SATA connectors. Click in there, there we go. Then the second one, we will go from the bottom. So this will be through the hole just above our power supply area. We actually have 2 Type-Cs on this motherboard. And we have our pretty standard front panel I/O. We have a power switch, reset switch, and hard drive LED. So we're gonna wanna put it, your typical place on almost any motherboard, bottom right of the board. So bottom row pins 3 and 4. There they are. Hard drive LED, bottom row pins 1 and 2. These ones are polarity, so we do want the positive side facing the left of the board. And our power switch will sit right on top of the reset switch. Only a few cables left. Let's get our HD audio in. Good chance this will never be used in a system like this. You have this much processing and graphical horsepower, you'll likely spring for an external audio amplifier. So this case has 2 RGB connectors. One is input from your motherboard or your RGB controller, and we have a second one that you can actually daisy chain into other addressable RGB components. Okay, so we got our connector in. So now it's time to get a handle on some of these cables back here before we proceed any further. So these are our CPU connectors. Oh. It's a big one. This board is a little different, unlike your conventional motherboard. Instead of your CPU connectors being up here in the top left, like a lot of ATX motherboards or even server motherboards, they put them down on the far edge. And we'll do the same with our 24-pin ATX cable for the motherboard power itself. So we may find it easier to actually remove our handy little NVMe riser. And you may notice this board actually does have an extra 6-pin power connector. CPU does overclock, but we're not pushing it to its extreme limits, so it won't be that power hungry. All right, so now that we have most of the cables in place, we'll start looking at installing our fans, our radiators, and our mechanism to actually mount the reservoirs. And we're gonna wanna install them right about here. It's realistically the only place we can install them on this case without extensive modifications. So to do that, we'll start prepping our work area in the case. We'll have to pop out these covers Phanteks pre-installs for you. So we've made a custom plate that'll cover the back half of the case, custom fabricated in our shop over at Eniac. So this will give us a nice convenient mounting point for our reservoirs. And it's fairly sturdy once all the screws are in place. And in nature, it is a very simple piece. It allows you to work some magic on a case like this. You'll just place it into your case, you'll measure it to fit, and you'll cut holes as needed. Okay, so our plate is installed. We should go ahead and start installing our mess of fans. So we're gonna be using a few QL140 RGB fans, as well as 3 Corsair 120mm RGB fans. So you do have an inner ring that lights up, as well as the outer ring as well, and they're all individually addressable as well. So all of these fans will actually run at about the same RPM. You can control your RPMs through the software itself, so you can make sure that even if it's a smaller fan or a bigger fan, they'll all run at a nice comfortable noise level. I anticipate we may need to actually remove this plate in order to get these fan cables in. Will we be able to sneak them in through our plate here? If we're lucky, we will. If we're not lucky, we'll have to unscrew all of those bolts again. So this, of course, is one of the downsides to making a custom PC. There's all the little road bumps you run into halfway through the build and realize, oh, you have to backtrack several steps. Slide this on back out. So we're gonna have a pretty typical layout on this computer. We're gonna have all intake on the front, intake on the bottom as well. So we're not fighting physics, and the hot air will rise to the top, and the fans can pull in cold air from the bottom. We'll just use every other screw for now to keep them in place. Let's use a bigger screw. Oh, don't want to drop the expensive computer yet. Gotta wait for the end. Now all the pieces fall into place. Let's go ahead and install the bottom radiator. So this Phanteks case has a nice little removable bottom radiator bracket. Okay, so we're gonna bring in our 360mm Corsair radiator. And of course, you do want to plan your build ahead before you go and do a water-cooled build, so that you know which direction your inlets and outlets need to be. So in this computer, we're going to have our inlets facing the back of the case. We want to prepare our 3 Corsair 120mm. Okay, so all 3 fans set the intake. We opted to cut a hole into the side of our custom bracket here so that we can route the cables a little bit more closer to where the Corsair Commander Pro will actually be. RGB is known for giving a significant performance boost to your gaming, actually. So if you set it to red, you'll get an extra 10 to 15 frames per second. And if you set it to blue, your computer will actually run cooler. We're going to look at installing the top radiator. This is a 420mm. Remember, off the top of my head, a 28mm thick radiator, same as the bottom, just larger surface area, so more cooling, of course. In this orientation, our fans are going to actually push through the radiator. This way, you can see the RGB from the inside of the case, of course. So it looks like our radiator at the top isn't going to fit as easily as we hoped. Okay, so we need to actually get the cables out of the way. So now the radiator is actually trying to sandwich the cables in between the motherboard. We are at the extreme limits of what you could fit in this case in terms of a radiator. We're getting very close to the final steps of the build, which are going to be graphics cards, plumbing, and then cable management. And of course, we can't forget the reservoirs as well. And D5 pumps are nice because they actually tend to run quieter than the smaller counterpart, which are known as DDC pumps. So before we actually lift those up to attach them, we're going to screw in this plate. So for the next part, I'm going to need an extra set of hands to actually help me align the reservoirs with the screw holes. So I'm going to have Daphne help me hold them You want to go ahead and just like hold these up, pull the wires through, and then you can just hold them up. Okay, now they should be secure. You should be able to let them go, and they're gonna fall off and break. No, they're good. So now we have 4 screws on the back of our plate supporting the reservoirs. So the graphics cards are gonna be probably the most difficult part of this build due to their weight and the fact they need to be joined together. So this will allow both of your cards to work in parallel to provide you more performance. These are actually, they used to be EVGA for the Win 3 3090s, and they've been water blocked using Optimus's, I believe the Supremacy water block. So they are very heavy cards, very substantial cards. These fittings fit with a special Allen key. This is a 8mm Allen key that came with the fitting kit. So that'll allow you to tighten it from both sides very conveniently. Now we're gonna go ahead and tighten on the compression fittings. So we're gonna set the opposite end for the top card's fittings onto the tube. Okay. Drop them down very carefully. So we're gonna align the top card and the bottom card's PCIe lanes and carefully align them with the slots on the motherboard, and then just gently press down on them. Okay, so both cards are secured. The clips on the PCIe lanes have locked into place. Now we can go ahead and screw the back of the PCIe covers in. So now all the main components are finally installed into the case. It is now incredibly heavy for a computer its size. So now we're going to reinstall that M.2 riser that we removed towards the beginning of the build. And we don't want to start running our tubes and whatnot while that's out. It's going to be hard to get it back in. So we're also going to install our actual NVLink bridge. So this is going to be what helps the graphics cards communicate with each other at a much higher speed than they would just through the PCIe lanes themselves. Pop those into place. Go ahead and clean off some fingerprints. So we have to install our final fan. This is going to be our rear fan. So keen eyes will probably see that we've made it even harder to reach the compression fittings when we eventually have to screw those in. Now we're going to snake in our 6 PCIe cables. I've already zip tied the 2 bundles of 3 together just to kind of help keep them in their own little group. So you're going to want to look at each end of your cable and find out which side is for the power supply and which side is for the graphics card. We're just going to let them dangle. So we're going to connect each of our PCIe cables. We're going to do the first bundle into the top card. Of course, it doesn't matter which connector you plug into which card, they're all going to the same place and they're all coming from the same place. Okay, so now we have a nice bundle and we can stake them together. We can make them look like a nice little V that disappears down the center of the cards out the back of the case. So now all we need to do is untangle a lot of these wires here and get them plugged into the power supply themselves. So all 6 are plugged in, 24 pin is plugged in, our 2 EPS cables are plugged in, and we're going to have a slew of SATA cables to plug in all our peripherals, as well as leaving one to the side so that we can add storage later. All right, so it's finally time to close this thing up. So although it looks very complicated once we get all the tubes in, it's not as complicated as it actually appears. So it's kind of like opening up a pickle jar. You just kind of keep trying until eventually it tightens. I left the bottom loose so that it can be adjusted just right. So now we have our first few pipes laid in. We have the outlet for our graphics cards, and we have the return tube going to the reservoir, and we have the beginning of the CPU loop forming here, going to the bottom radiator. So this is going to complete the loop for our Ryzen 3990X 64-core processor. And there we go. We have our completed dual loop system. So now I'm going to install the final 2 plugs onto the graphics cards for the unused ports. I want to make sure these are installed, otherwise fluid will evacuate the system, let's say unexpectedly. So this loop is going to have 2 separate fluids in it. We're going to have Primo Chill Opaque Red, and we have EK Cryofill Navy Blue. So I'm going to prepare a towel just in case we do spill a little bit or if something leaks. There's 2 loops, and since they're both plugged in, we're going to do both at the same time. We're going to do our graphics card loop blue, and we're going to do red for the CPU loop, because it is AMD after all. God, that stuff is actually alcohol. So you're gonna wanna keep filling a reservoir, cycling the pumps. Try to get as few air bubbles into the system as possible. And then don't mind the fact that the RGB lighting isn't all on. That is something you have to configure on after the system boots. So now we're going to close off our reservoirs. The final piece of RGB, our handmade Eniac logo. Connected to our RGB header, and that'll complete the system. Going to make sure to reinstall our dust covers. Double check all your fittings one last time just to make sure they're nice and tight. And it looks like we're good to go. Drop it on in, and we have a finished system. And now it's time to fire our computer up. And now we're going to run one of our test benchmarks to see the extreme compute performance of our 3990X 64-core processor. This is Cinebench R23 multi-core test running on a stock 3990X using only AMD's Precision Boost Overdrive. So this build is using AMD's 3990X 64-core 128 thread Threadripper in conjunction with two EVGA For the Win 3 3090s set up in SLI, all attached to a Asus ROG Zenith Extreme motherboard and 128 gigs of DDR4 4000 MHz Corsair Vengeance memory. We also have two Samsung 980 Pro 1TB NVMe's currently configured in RAID 0 for maximum speed. To cool the system, we have two radiators, 360mm at the bottom and a 420mm at the top in a dual loop setup. So that means one loop for the graphics cards and one loop for the CPU, all cooled by a total of 10 Corsair QL 120 and 140 RGB fans. I'm Frank from Eniac PC Builder. Thanks for watching Newegg Monster Build.